The sonnet is a box or frame, longer than it is broad, which is by convention, the sonnet, exactly the size of the picture of a person engaged in, responsive to relationship, and particularly that class of relation, that sense of love in which the life, which is to say the meaning of the person, is at stake. When history, that story about the life of meaning which Milton read in the newspapers of 1655, when history became the scene in which the intelligibility of the world was put in question, as it has been in our time, then the sonnet became a scene also of history, without ceasing to be the theater of love. The sonnet is, in some sense, the archetypal structure of Western lyric art, because Western lyric art is addressed to the crisis of the person who is constructed by relationship, of which one name is love and another cosmos, or the rationality of the world. The sonnet is composed of 14 lines. The unit of the line is the abstract and distinguishing basis of Western poetry altogether. I want you to think for a moment about the line as separate from the structures which can be formed by the joining of lines. A line, what's a line? A line is a string of words from the natural language, which is of abstractly determined length, and which, because of its abstractness, can enter into any sequence of combinations consistent with its structure. The word line is akin to the word lineament, as we say, the lineaments of a person's face, which characterize him and make him unmistakable for another. The word line is associated with linen, the weaving from flax. It's associated with the bird linnet, because the linnet, as it turns out, feeds on flaxseed. And it is from flaxseed that we make linen, and linen is the very type of the line, as we find it in poetry, which practice was called stitching in some of the Greek terms that refer to it. A line is a string of words from the natural language which is of abstractly determined length, and which, because of its abstractness, can enter into any sequence of combinations consistent with its structure. The line functions as the stage of presence, the theater of presence on which all the acts and sayings of persons in poetry are played out. The line is diagnostic of the presence of poetry altogether. Now, there are three classes of line in English. The line shorter than 10, for example, the ballad line 8 and 6. The line longer than 10, for example, the line of 14, 8 and 6 written long. 8 plus 6 is 14. And the modal or tonic line, which is the line of 10 itself, and is the line of the sonnet and this sonnet. Avenge to, O Lord, for thy slaught 6, or saints 8, whose bones 10. Very simple. This abstract and fundamental rationality, the rationality of counting to a determined number in the universal language of number, has the power, because of its abstraction and universality, and because of its marriage to the consensual rationality, irrationality made rational by consent, of the destination of counting 10 to produce the image of the voice of the person realized in relationship. The line shorter than 10 seems to know something about relationship, but has no act consistent with relationship. The line longer than 10 is almost always conserved for high states of consciousness in which relationship has been left behind, including drunkenness, laughter, and sexual pleasure. The line of 10 is the line in which the rationality of persons is at stake, whether in Shakespeare's interactive situation of the line in dramatic exchange, or in Milton's struggle with the understandability of the world in the face of the default of his God's rationality. The line of 10 as a structure was stained by the success of Shakespeare's use of blank verse, so that it came to mean, and still does, the line in which persons speak, whose speech makes a difference, 10 being conventionally, after Shakespeare, the distance between one person and another. Now, the significance of line as such is the abstract identity of all lines as vehicles of poetic language, which is always some version of natural language, always and in every instance by another abstract principle, non-identical both with other instances of itself. No two lines say the same thing, and with line itself. Poetry is thus constituted of a phoenix principle of self-identity, abstract metrical structure, and a turtle-dove principle of language constituted by difference and completed only by versions of its kind which are not the self. Thus the poem is composed of two systems of radically different kinds: the system of metrical lines and sequences thereof, and the system of the sentence, whose laws are the grammatical laws of natural language by which syntax is produced. The poem persists and comes to being at the meeting, as I have said, of these two radically different systems, the abstract, the arbitrary, and the irrational system of the metrical line on the one hand, acquires its meanings as abstract structures do only by the stain of usage, and that other system, the sentence, whose laws are the grammatical laws of natural language by which syntax is produced. The relationship of line and language, of abstract structure, the count of 10 on the one hand, and the sentence with its natural language syntactic orders on the other, is of fundamental importance. At the moment of the breakage of cosmos, the poem supplies an order which the universe no longer can contribute to the human story. Now, there are two states of the relation between sentence and line. The first state is the state of affairs where sentence and line coincide, where the sentence ends when the line ends. Where the sentence and line coincide, we find a state of affairs in which the order supplied by the poem and signified by the fulfillment of the count is all the order that the will of the speaker can imagine. The speaker has nothing to say that overflows the metrical unit. Such a state of affairs signifies either an ecstatic reconciliation, a correspondence between the world human beings can make in the world that is as in the Phoenix and the Turtle and the Divine Comedy, or by contrast it may signify a tragic concession to a state of affairs which cannot be willed otherwise, an abandonment of other possibilities of the will, as in Frost, or in the tragic fortitude of the speaker in the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens. The king, too, sits in for Dum fair 6, lean tune 8. There is nothing more to be said. In Milton's sonnet, however, things are very different. The order of syntax, the sentences that must be said, and the order of poetic structure, the metrical line, and the sonnet system of lines which make poetic speech possible are in relationships not of coincidence, but of non-coincidence. The rationality of the abstract metrical line, the principle of visibility and reparation the poem can supply, is not sufficient and contributes no peace, restores no adequate justice. The first line, Avenge too, O Lord, for thy slaught 6 or 8, whose bones, takes the God into the speech of the person and demands restoration of fundamental loss, which would constitute assurance that the description of God, which makes the world understandable to Milton, is true. The saints, incidentally, in this poem are not the Catholic persons of privilege, whose compensation is assured by the institution of the church, whose head is the triple tyrant of line 12. The saints in Milton's poem are every member of the Protestant body, of which Milton's body is a member in the literal sense. But the fact of their death already in advance assures that such assurance is impossible. The line ends, their bones, 9-10. But the syntax, the natural order of the language in which the man cries out, is incomplete. The metrical line is complete. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The syntax is incomplete. Their bones completes nothing. Lie scattered on the alpine mountains cold. The state of affairs which finds the line complete but the syntax incomplete is called, in the jargon of poetic analysis, as most of you know, run-on or enjambment. Now look at your texts. Line 2 ends with a coincidence of metrical account and syntax. Mountains cold, 8, 9, 10. Because in the relentless logic of the poem, the coldness of death and the power of the natural world over the ensouled person is an indisputable fact of experience. Milton's poem is throughout a poem in which two minds are struggling in the same man. The mind characterized by the will to order, the metrical mind, and the mind characterized by acknowledgement of the truth of historical experience, syntactic mind. The product of this struggle is rage, the struggle between, as I say, the mind characterized by abstract order, metrical mind, and the mind characterized in effect by its capacity to observe that reality does not reproduce the abstract order either of God's will or of the metrical line. Syntax, the grammatical, experience-referent mind, and the metrical mind are in a state of non-coincidence, and this non-coincidence is reproduced over and over again in this poem in dozens of ways. The product of the struggle, as I say, is rage, and this rage reproduces itself across time. We will encounter it in the 19th and the 20th century in the small set of poems that we study. The rage for a state of affairs which matches our capacity to represent states of affairs in the presence of states of affairs which we cannot represent is a rage that is with us at this very moment in this very room. The product of this struggle, as I say, is rage. The stocks and stones recall the Catholic world which Puritan Protestantism, which Milton serves, destroyed in the interest of its living God. Poetry, like religion, intends the conservation of the human image. Milton has invested poetry, the metrical mind, in the Protestant cause, but the speaking man, syntactic mind, has more and other to say. The struggle is initially registered in the skew of line and sentence, which we have indexed by the technical term enjambment. Now, the most ancient and traditionally honored function of poetry, the most common purpose for which the will, without other means, turns to poetry, is that apodictic purpose I have discovered for you in the poem on Sir Patrick Spence, the making of the image of the person whose act is worthy of an image. Another way of speaking of this function is memorialization, the remembering of persons. Milton's speaker has delegated the effective hope of the memorializing function in a poetry which is in turn invested in the Protestant God. Thus he cries to that God, "Forget not, in thy book record their groans." Notice in Milton there is a fear of the heterocosmos. That is to say, the effort to replace the book of God by the book of mankind, which is the poetic book. The counterposition of these two books, which delegates to the book of God a power which it does not seem to have at the very moment that it writes with its left hand. The poem, or the book of man, calls attention, in effect, to a rift in the relationship between the outcome that the will intends and a former and a latter means. To command the God to be consistent with his servant's story about him is to threaten that God, the rememberer who forgets, with death. For the God who is inconsistent with his description is not God. The very act of the poem lays a book which is potentially not God's book beside the book of God and uses God's words, for this poem is full of biblical words against God as evidence of God's own death. The voice of the slaughtered saints is amplified by echo and goes up, the meaningless vertical cry, the parody of prayer in the enjambment not only of the horizontal line, but of the conventional division in the vertical line of the poem. Remember, the vertical line of the sonnet is a line consisting of 2 units, first of 8 and then of 6, requiring that the ninth line commence a new syntactic unit. Line 7, look at your text, mother and infant down the rocks, their moans. Line 8, the vales redoubled to the hills, and they. Line 9, to heaven. In the case of this poem, line severs, as history has, the relation between persons and source, which, if syntactically joined, would give comfort. The bonding function is accomplished only by the poem as a whole, if at all, if and only if the unity of the artifact, the thing of human making, is capable of obtaining justice in the absence of a God whose presence the facts of history, the news, has already canceled. The last 3 lines of the poem opens with a syntactic rhyme. Now, you're accustomed to phonic rhymes, rhymes in the ear, that occur on the right-hand side of lines. I wish to add to your repertory of analytic means the idea, if it is unfamiliar to you, of syntactic rhyme. Rhyme which consists of like and different occurrences of the same grammatical or syntactic state of affairs. Rhyme in the ear is situated in poetic practice, as you know, in our modern poetics, at the end of lines, the right-hand side. Rhyme in the rational mind of the voice, syntactic rhyme, tends to be situated to the left of the line at line opening. The last 3 lines of the poem open with the triple tyrant in the grammatical place of the Protestant God. The triple tyrant, avenge, O Lord, that from these may grow 100-fold, who having learnt thy woe, early may fly the Babylonian. Having learnt thy way, I beg your pardon, early may fly the Babylonian woe. What does woe mean? Woe means here calamity inflicted as punishment. The last strategy of the speaking will of the person who speaks in this poem is the sowing of the remains of the atrociously dead, the turning of their death into public knowledge, and thus the making of their death rational, the making of their death meaning, with the effect of raising soldiers like Cromwell's army who will repeat atrocity, the destruction in the imagination of this poem of Catholicism and its saints, the destruction in historical fact of the Irish and the helpless inhabitants of the cities of Ireland that Cromwell, in the interest of making history speak, the story about it told by God, ruthlessly destroyed. The intention of this poem is to propose that the Catholic world of Italy will be destroyed, all except those persons who somehow read the Catholic atrocity committed against Protestants in the Piedmont as somehow a manifestation of justice. Metrical systems, the abstract voice of the poem as an order that gives presence to the voice of the persons. And syntactic systems, by contrast to metrical systems, syntactic systems are reality vectored, must coincide twice in every poem, once at the beginning and once at the end of the poem, and those are singular moments. This is a requirement of the principle of the made thing, which we call closure. The opening of the poem is a break with silence which has been preceded by a gathering of powers toward an absolutely constrained situation to which there is no solution than poetry. The end of the poem exhibits what those powers have obtained at the moment when the poetic means has come to an end and the principle of the poem as artifact has asserted that there must be no more, or the artifact will lose its wholeness, its closure, which defines its form in terms of the satisfaction. We call it beauty, or we call it justice, of the made thing. Milton's sonnet completes its structure, satisfies its metrical mind, without completing the purposes of the syntactic or speaking person, without completing its rational or syntactic mind. It is a poem completed before the action which it intends has been completed. The action which it intended was the rationality of the world. And the poem, in the interest of its artifactual completeness, its sonnetness, came to an end before reason was restored to the state of affairs, which gave rise to poetic speaking at all. The repetition of atrocity is not the solution to atrocity, and above all the process of teaching about the death of the Waldensians, mother and infant down the rocks, what Milton's speaker calls sowing the martyred blood and ashes, does not recover their agonized minds, of which Milton, a member of their members, is one. The poem signifies and makes us know, because it knows, a crisis of compensation, which is a crisis of the investment of poetry in the Judeo-Christian God, and a crisis also of poetry itself, always intended to compensate by restoring the human image. This poem is inscribed with several histories of the destruction of great communicative systems, systems for the conserving of the human image, the Catholic system in which saints are conserved and conserve, the monarchical system permanently weakened by Cromwell's execution of Charles I, in which the king protects and validates the human image. Perhaps also the Protestant system, which in England had for the moment displaced both Catholicism and monarchy. Poetry in such a case becomes not merely the supplement or handmaiden or the mere successor, but the supersessor to predecessor powers of enormous antiquity and force. The rage which this poem ends expresses the incompleteness of the poem itself as an act in the absence of other social institutions capable of supplying justice, as much as, indeed more surely than, it expresses the incompleteness of any historical action of redress in the poem. Poetry is also, therefore, as I have said, put in question as compensation for fundamental loss. And that question generates the deep narratives of the poems from a later period, which follow as the subjects of the next 4 lectures in this series. What this poem by Milton exemplifies is the ravaging birth of poetry as a merely secular practice. This poem predicts both the investment and the limits upon the power of poetry as it will become the resource of the will toward the intelligibility of the world and the conservation of the human image in the ages characterized by the poems which we will study in the next set of these lectures.